A poor black girl saved a stranger from kidnappers, then learned he was a billionaire CEO. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's incredible story. Naomi Carter had never expected to be part of something that would change the course of her life. She had lived a life filled with struggles, working long shifts at the Bayou Spoon, a small restaurant tucked away in the heart of New Orleans. It was a humble place where the clink of silverware and the quiet hum of jazz were the soundtrack to Naomi's daily grind. But on that stormy night, everything changed. Naomi had been about to close up the restaurant when she saw him. A man stumbling through the door, bleeding, soaked in rain, and barely conscious. The storm had been raging outside, the streets flooded, and the phones were down. She could hardly see anything through the sheets of rain hitting the windows. But what caught her attention was the desperation in the man's eyes, the way he whispered, "Please don't let them find me," before collapsing at her feet. Naomi's heart raced. There was no time to think. She couldn't just let him lie there. Without hesitation, she rushed to his side, pulling him inside and locking the doors behind her. The man was clearly in danger, and despite all the uncertainty, Naomi's instincts took over. She grabbed a towel, wrapped it around his shoulders, and checked for any signs of identification or weapons, but there was nothing. His clothes were designer, his shirt torn, his hands bruised, but there were no clues as to who he was or why he was being chased. She looked at him, her mind racing. Was he a victim of a robbery, a mob hit, or something worse? She couldn't be sure, but she knew she couldn't leave him there. Naomi had been overlooked her entire life. Growing up, she was the girl who was never quite enough for the opportunities she dreamed about. She'd applied for countless jobs, faced rejection after rejection, simply because of her skin color or her background. But tonight wasn't about her. It was about this man, whoever he was, and the decision she had to make. She could have walked away, left him to his fate. It wasn't her problem, right? But Naomi wasn't like that. She never had been. She had always believed in doing the right thing, even when no one was watching, even when the world seemed determined to ignore her. She took a deep breath and called for help. The phones weren't working, but she had to try. She needed to find out who this man was and why he was so terrified. As she knelt beside him, her hands trembling, the storm raged on outside. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary night. This wasn't just a random stranger in need of help. There was something more. But Naomi didn't have time to question it. She had to act fast. The rain continued to pour outside, but inside the small restaurant, a sense of quiet urgency filled the air. Naomi Carter had just made a choice. The next few hours would change everything, and she had no idea just how much. Naomi stood there, her breath shallow as the storm raged outside. The man was still unconscious, but now that the adrenaline had started to wear off, her mind began to race. She had done what she could, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. The man, whose face she now saw more clearly, was not someone she would expect to find in her small New Orleans neighborhood. His designer clothes, his expensive watch, the way he had collapsed at her feet. He was clearly someone important. But who was he really? And why was he being chased? Naomi had no answers, but she knew she couldn't leave him there. She had already made the choice to help him, and now she needed to know more. She carefully moved around him, checking his pockets one last time for any identification. All she found was a metallic card, tucked into the inner lining of his jacket. There was no name, no address, no clue about his identity. Just a card with a strange emblem she didn't recognize. Naomi didn't have time to think about it too much. She knew the right thing to do was get him to safety. But where? Her tiny apartment wasn't an option, and she couldn't take him to the police. There was too much risk. The best she could do was keep him safe for now and figure out the next step later. She grabbed a blanket from the back of the restaurant and carefully draped it over him. As the rain pounded against the windows, Naomi found herself thinking about the decision she had made that night. She had always lived a life of quiet endurance. Growing up, she was used to being overlooked, rejected, and dismissed because of the color of her skin. She knew the pain of never quite being enough in the eyes of others. But tonight, she had made a choice that had nothing to do with being overlooked. She had chosen to do what was right, not because it was easy, but because it was who she was. It wasn't the first time she had stood up for someone in need, but tonight felt different. Tonight, she wasn't just helping someone who was hurt. Tonight, she was taking a risk that could change everything. She glanced at the man again, his face pale in the dim light of the restaurant. Naomi didn't know what had brought him to this point. Was he a victim of some violent crime, or was he tangled in something much bigger than that? She couldn't say, but there was one thing she knew for sure. His life was in her hands, at least for the moment. The man stirred, his eyes fluttering open, and Naomi instinctively leaned forward, hoping to offer him some reassurance. He looked at her, his confusion evident. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice hoarse and weak. Naomi's heart raced again. "You're safe," she replied, her voice steady, though she didn't quite feel it. "You passed out in my restaurant last night. You had a pretty nasty fall. Do you remember anything?" He blinked slowly, trying to gather his thoughts. "The Bayou Spoon, right?" Naomi nodded. "That's the place." The man drank from the glass of water she had placed in front of him, his hand shaking slightly. Naomi noticed it, but she didn't comment on it. Instead, she watched him closely, waiting for him to speak. Finally, he did. "I owe you my life," he said quietly. His words were simple, but they felt heavy in the air. Naomi didn't answer right away. She couldn't. She had already guessed who he was, and the realization hit her like a wave. His face, now fully illuminated by the light in the room, was all too familiar. The sharp cheekbones, the dark eyes that seemed to scrutinize everything, the angular jawline. Naomi had seen him before. Ethan Monroe, the CEO of Monroe Tech, one of the biggest tech companies in the region. The man who had rejected her application months ago, claiming she wasn't the right fit for the company. The man who had once decided that she wasn't worth the investment, simply because of how she looked. She took a deep breath, trying to control the emotions flooding through her. She hadn't realized how much it had hurt, that rejection. How much it had stung when her qualifications weren't enough, when her potential wasn't seen. And now, here he was, in her restaurant, in her home, a broken man in need of help. "I know who you are," Naomi said, her voice tight with restrained anger. Ethan looked up at her, his face faltering for a moment. "Yeah," he replied, his voice low. "I thought you might." Naomi couldn't help but feel the irony of it all. Here he was, in her place, relying on her to save him. After everything he had dismissed, after everything he had turned his back on, he was now the one who needed help. It was almost poetic. "Funny how life works, huh?" Naomi continued, the bitterness in her tone unmistakable. Ethan looked away, his expression filled with guilt, and something else, something Naomi couldn't quite place. He was struggling, but she wasn't sure if he was struggling with the situation or with his own conscience. But Naomi didn't have time to dwell on that. She had already made her decision. She would help him, even if he didn't deserve it, even if it meant putting herself at risk, because that was who she was. "I didn't mean to involve you," Ethan began, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. "I didn't even know where I was going. I just ran." Naomi raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Ran from who?" she asked, her voice sharp. Ethan leaned forward, his face tense as he ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "From a board meeting," he said, his voice low, and filled with regret. "I was supposed to expose some illegal activity. There were people at that meeting who didn't want the truth to come out. They tried to stop me before I could say anything." Naomi listened intently, her mind racing as she tried to piece together the fragments of his story. "You were targeted?" she asked. Ethan nodded, his face a mixture of exhaustion and shame. "Yes, I had everything. Emails, recordings, proof. But someone tipped them off, and before I knew it, I was running for my life." Naomi's heart skipped a beat. This was bigger than she had imagined. The man who had rejected her was now entangled in a dangerous game, one she couldn't ignore. But what could she do? She had already committed to helping him, and she wasn't about to back out now. "You're safe here for now," Naomi said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "But we need to figure out what to do next." Ethan looked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he said quietly. Naomi just nodded, her mind already racing with the next steps. She didn't know where this was headed, but one thing was certain. She had just made a decision that would change her life and his, forever. Naomi stood in the quiet restaurant, the dim light flickering against the rain-streaked windows as she tried to make sense of everything Ethan had just told her. A billionaire CEO running for his life, chased by men trying to silence the truth, collapsing in her arms like a wounded stranger in the night. It was too much and somehow not enough, because every second that passed made her more aware that whoever wanted Ethan dead would not simply give up. She took a slow breath and looked at him, really looked at him. He was exhausted, bruised, and fighting to stay upright. But behind the fear in his eyes, there was something else, something she had never seen in him before. Vulnerability. Not the carefully curated kind executives show on magazine covers, but the real kind that comes from knowing your life is hanging by a thread. Naomi crossed her arms and leaned against the counter. You said you had proof. If they wanted to stop you, they will not stop looking. They will want that evidence destroyed. Ethan nodded weakly. The access card you found. That is the only way into the server. Everything is there. Every transaction. Every message. Enough to bring the entire operation down. Naomi felt a chill run through her, and it had nothing to do with the storm outside. She glanced toward the locked doors, half expecting shadowy figures to appear at any moment. So they will come here, she said quietly. Ethan swallowed hard. If they know I survived, yes. Naomi ran her hand over her forehead, trying to steady her breath. She had dreamed of being part of a world like his, the world of tech, innovation, and opportunity. But not like this. Not with danger closing in from every direction. Without warning, a loud crack of thunder shook the building. Ethan flinched, and Naomi instinctively moved closer, scanning the windows for movement. The storm had not let up. If anything, it was getting worse, the kind of storm that swallowed streets and silenced sirens. She turned back to him, her voice firm. We cannot stay here. They will find you. Maybe not now, but soon. Ethan rubbed his temples, wincing from the pain. Where can we go? I do not know this part of the city. Naomi hesitated. She had one idea. One place no one would think to look. One place she had avoided for years because it held too many memories. There is somewhere, she said slowly. An old church near the edge of downtown. It has been abandoned since Hurricane Katrina. My father used to be the pastor there. The building is condemned, but the basement is still dry. We can hide there until we figure out what to do. Ethan looked at her with disbelief. You would take me there? After everything I did? After I rejected your application without even meeting you? Naomi held his gaze, her voice steady. I am not helping you because of who you are. I am helping you because of who I am. Ethan exhaled deeply, the weight of her words settling onto him like a heavy truth. Naomi pushed away from the counter and went to the storage closet, grabbing a flashlight, 2 coats, and a pair of old boots that might fit Ethan's bruised feet. We leave in 5 minutes, she said. The storm will cover our tracks. Ethan tried to stand, but his legs buckled. Naomi caught him before he fell, her hands gripping his arms with surprising strength. Easy, she murmured. If you collapse out there, I cannot drag you across the city. He gave a small, breathless laugh, more from exhaustion than humor. I will try. Naomi steadied him, then looked him straight in the eyes. This is life or death, Ethan. If we are doing this, you have to trust me completely. No questions. No hesitation. Ethan nodded. I trust you. Naomi had heard those words before from people who never meant them. But this time they sounded different. Maybe because he finally understood what it felt like to have nothing but someone else's mercy keeping you alive. 5 minutes later, coats pulled tight and flashlight in hand, Naomi pushed open the back door of the restaurant. The storm hit them like a wall, sheets of rain slamming against their faces, wind howling through the alley. Naomi gripped Ethan's arm. Stay close. We move fast. And together, the billionaire who once dismissed her and the poor girl he overlooked stepped into the storm, unaware that the night was far from over and the danger was only beginning. The storm showed no mercy as Naomi and Ethan made their way through the dark alleyways, the heavy rain soaking them to the bone. The streets were deserted, the city swallowed by the relentless downpour, the kind of storm that made everything feel like it was drowning in shadows. Naomi kept her eyes focused ahead, her grip on Ethan's arm never faltering. She could feel his body trembling beside her, his breath shallow as he struggled to keep up with the pace. The weight of what they were doing hung in the air between them. Naomi had never imagined that her life would lead her to this moment, standing in the pouring rain, guiding a man who had once dismissed her to safety. But she couldn't afford to look back, not now. Not when they were so close to their destination. She glanced over at him, his face pale, his eyes clouded with exhaustion and fear. "How much further?" Ethan asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. Naomi didn't answer right away. The church was only a few blocks away, but it felt like miles in the storm. She could see the faint outline of it now, the old, decaying structure barely visible through the rain. It was a place that held too many memories, but it was also the only place where they would be safe, at least for the time being. "Just a little longer," Naomi replied, her voice steady despite the pounding rain and the fear that gnawed at her insides. They reached the church just as the storm seemed to intensify, the wind howling like a living thing. Naomi pushed open the rusted gate and led Ethan toward the side entrance, her mind racing. She had no plan beyond this. She had no idea how long they could stay hidden in the church, no idea what would happen next. But for now, this was their only option. The door creaked as Naomi opened it, the sound echoing through the abandoned building. Inside, it was dark and cold, the air thick with the smell of dust and mildew. Naomi turned on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. The basement, she knew, was the only safe place. She guided Ethan down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. "We'll stay down here until we figure out what to do next," she said, her voice echoing off the stone walls. Ethan didn't respond. He was too tired, too beaten down, to say anything. Naomi didn't expect him to. She set the flashlight down on the floor, its weak light flickering as they stood in the damp, dark space. Naomi could hear the sound of Ethan's breathing, ragged and uneven, as he collapsed onto the cold concrete floor. She sat down beside him, her legs aching from the long walk through the storm, but she didn't care. All that mattered now was that they were safe, at least for the moment. She looked at him, her thoughts a jumble of confusion and anger. She had never imagined that her life would take this turn. A few days ago, she was just another waitress in a rundown restaurant, trying to make ends meet. Now, she was hiding a billionaire CEO in an abandoned church, uncertain of what would come next. But something had shifted in her during these last few hours. Something had changed, not just in Ethan, but in herself. She had always known what it felt like to be invisible, to be passed over, to be dismissed because of the color of her skin and the life she lived. But in this moment, with Ethan sitting beside her, Naomi realized that the world wasn't just about power and wealth. It was about choices. It was about what you did when no one was looking, when no one cared. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it was hard. "You saved my life," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. Naomi looked at him, her face unreadable. "I didn't do it for you," she replied quietly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Ethan nodded slowly, as if he understood. Naomi could see the change in him. He wasn't the same man who had dismissed her, who had treated her like she was invisible. He was broken, yes, but in that brokenness, there was a glimpse of the man who might have been. Naomi stood up and walked to the far corner of the basement, her mind still racing. What now? She didn't have the answers. She didn't know what would happen next. All she knew was that she couldn't go back to the life she had before. Not after this. Not after what she had seen in Ethan. She turned back to him, her heart heavy with the weight of the situation. "We need to figure out what to do next," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and something else, something Naomi couldn't quite place. "What happens now?" he asked. Naomi didn't have an answer for him, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let anyone else make the decisions for her anymore. For the first time in her life, Naomi was in control, and that scared her more than anything else. The hours passed slowly in the cold, dark basement of the old church, the only sounds the howling storm outside and the occasional creak of the old building settling. Naomi had been sitting across from Ethan, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, each one more overwhelming than the last. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The storm was their only ally, but as the night wore on, Naomi knew that it wouldn't last forever. Soon, the rain would stop, the streets would dry, and the danger would catch up with them. Ethan had finally fallen into a restless sleep, his body exhausted from the strain of the past few days. Naomi looked at him, the man who had once rejected her, who had once treated her like she was invisible. Now, he was the one who was vulnerable, and Naomi had become his lifeline. She had never imagined herself in this situation, let alone with someone like him. The world she had once dreamed of was so far out of reach now, and yet, here she was, caught in the middle of a storm with a man who had everything and nothing at the same time. The silence was broken by a soft groan from Ethan as he stirred, his eyes blinking open, slowly adjusting to the dim light of the basement. Naomi was still sitting there, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. She had no idea what she was supposed to do next, no idea what her future held now. All she knew was that she couldn't go back to the life she had before. I know this is a lot to ask, but Ethan's voice trailed off as he tried to sit up, his body weak and still recovering from the injuries he had sustained. Naomi looked at him, her expression unreadable. "But what?" she asked, her voice steady but cautious. Ethan looked at her, his eyes searching for something in her face, something he couldn't quite name. "But I don't know what to do next. I'm not sure where to go or who to trust. I've been running for so long, and now I'm here, with you, and I just don't know what to do." Naomi watched him closely, taking in his words. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the fear that he was about to lose everything. For the first time since he had collapsed in her restaurant, he looked small, vulnerable. She didn't feel sorry for him, though. What he was asking for wasn't sympathy. It was something much more valuable. It was trust. Naomi stood up, her boots heavy against the concrete floor, and walked toward the small window at the back of the basement. She peered through the grime-covered glass, her breath fogging up the surface. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, glistening under the dim light of the street lamps. Naomi turned back to Ethan. "You're asking the wrong person," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I don't have the answers for you. I don't know where you can go or who you can trust. But I do know this. You can't keep running. You need to make a choice, Ethan. You need to decide who you want to be now." Ethan looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Naomi took a deep breath, her eyes steady as she looked at him. "You're not the man you were before. You've seen things. You've experienced things. And you've made choices. But this is different. You've got to decide whether you're going to keep hiding or if you're going to fight back." Ethan's eyes widened slightly. "Fight back." Naomi nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Yes, fight back. You're not some helpless victim, Ethan. You have power. You've always had power. But you've never had to use it. Now you do." There was a long silence between them. Ethan's gaze dropped to the floor, his mind racing with the weight of Naomi's words. She was right. He had been hiding, running, making deals, thinking he could outsmart everyone. But now he was trapped, and the only way out was to face whatever was coming head-on. Ethan knew he had a choice to make. He could keep hiding, running from the people who wanted him silenced, or he could fight. He had been a leader in the business world, but now he had to lead in a different way. "I don't know if I can do this," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Naomi stepped closer, her face determined. "You don't have to do it alone," she said, her voice steady with resolve. "You've got me, and I'm not going anywhere." Ethan looked up at her, his expression softening. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like he wasn't completely alone in the world. Naomi didn't pity him. She didn't look at him like he was some kind of hero. She looked at him like he was a person, someone who still had a chance to make a difference. She believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. And in that moment, Ethan made a choice. He wasn't going to run anymore. He wasn't going to hide. He wasn't going to let the world decide what happened to him. He was going to fight. And he was going to fight with everything he had left. As the days passed, Naomi and Ethan remained hidden in the abandoned church, their small world growing tighter with each passing hour. The storm had long since subsided, but the tension between them remained, thick in the air. Naomi could see the change in Ethan. He was no longer the man who had walked into her restaurant with the arrogance of a billionaire CEO. He had shed the polished exterior, and though his clothes were still expensive, they now seemed out of place in the rundown church. He wasn't just hiding from those who sought to destroy him anymore. He was searching for something deeper, something inside himself. Naomi, too, was changing. She had always been the quiet observer, the one who stood on the sidelines, never quite fitting into the world she had been born into. But now, with Ethan's fate intertwined with hers, she found herself stepping into a new role. She was no longer just the waitress from the Bayou Spoon. She was someone who had the power to shape the course of events, someone who could make a difference. That realization hit her harder than she expected. She had always wanted to be part of something bigger than herself, but she had never imagined it would happen like this. The door creaked open, and Ethan stepped into the room, his face tired but resolute. Naomi looked up at him, her brow furrowed as she noticed the change in his demeanor. He had been pacing for hours, lost in thought, but now he was standing tall, a sense of determination in his eyes. "I'm going to do it," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with an urgency Naomi hadn't heard before. "I'm going to take down the people who did this to me. I'm not hiding anymore. I'm fighting back." Naomi set her book down, looking at him closely. She knew this moment would come. She had known from the start that Ethan wasn't the type to stay hidden forever. He had too much pride, too much ambition. But seeing him finally take control of his fate was different from what she had expected. She had always been the one making the hard choices, the one standing on the edge, balancing on the line between right and wrong. And now, it was his turn. "How do you plan to do that?" Naomi asked, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of her own doubts. Ethan hesitated, glancing down at his hands as if searching for the right words. "I have proof. I have everything I need to expose them. The board members, the investors, everything. The only thing I need now is a way to get it out there." Naomi raised an eyebrow, surprised. "And you think that's enough? You think exposing them will stop them from coming after you?" Ethan nodded. "It has to be enough. It's the only way to make sure they never hurt anyone again." Naomi studied him for a long moment, the weight of the decision hanging in the air between them. She could see the fear behind his eyes, but there was something else there too, something that reminded her of herself. The fear of not being enough, of not doing enough, and the desperate need to prove to the world that you matter. She stood up slowly, walking over to him. "I don't think it will be that easy," Naomi said softly. "These people have power. They have resources. If you go after them, they will come for you. And they won't stop until they've erased everything you've built." Ethan's eyes hardened, the resolve in them stronger than ever. "Then I'll make sure they know I'm not backing down. I've lived my life behind a mask for too long, Naomi. It's time to take it off and show the world who I really am." Naomi sighed, feeling the weight of his words. She knew he was right. The time for hiding was over. If Ethan was going to fight, he was going to need her help, and she was ready to give it. "Okay," she said, her voice steady. "I'll help you. But you have to understand, it's not going to be easy. You can't just waltz back into your old life and expect everything to go back to normal." Ethan nodded, his face softening. "I know. I'm ready for whatever comes next." Naomi looked at him for a long moment, her heart racing with the uncertainty of the path ahead. She had always known what it was like to fight for something, to keep going even when the odds were stacked against you. But this time, the stakes were higher. This time, it wasn't just her future at risk, it was his. And she wasn't sure if they would both make it out alive. But as she looked into Ethan's eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen before: hope. Not the naive kind, but the kind that comes when someone has nothing left to lose and is ready to burn everything down to make sure they get what they want. Naomi couldn't help but feel a spark of that hope herself. For the first time in a long while, she believed they might actually have a chance. "Let's do this," she said, her voice resolute. Ethan looked at her, his expression a mix of gratitude and determination. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." Naomi nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Don't thank me yet. We still have a long way to go." And with that, they both stepped into the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them. Naomi and Ethan's plan was simple, but that didn't mean it was going to be easy. They spent the next few days holed up in the church, strategizing, making calls, and trying to figure out their next move. Naomi kept the pressure low, her mind working overtime, while Ethan began to regain some of his strength. The truth was, he didn't know who to trust anymore. The world he had built was crumbling beneath him, and now, for the first time in his life, he was on the outside looking in. Naomi, on the other hand, had always known what it felt like to be an outsider. Her entire life, she had been fighting to prove that she was more than what people saw on the surface, that she was more than just another waitress in a rundown restaurant. But now, in this moment, she found herself facing an even bigger fight. They were about to go up against some of the most powerful people in the world, People who had everything to lose and wouldn't hesitate to destroy anyone who stood in their way. Naomi knew this fight wouldn't be easy, but she also knew there was no turning back. The storm outside had cleared, but the one inside their lives was only beginning. They made their way to a hidden location, a safe house Naomi had found on one of her many walks around the city, a place she could trust. Ethan didn't ask questions, though he could sense Naomi's careful steps and the way her eyes darted around, making sure they weren't being followed. He knew she was just as scared as he was, but she didn't show it. Naomi led him through the back door of a modest, unassuming house tucked between two larger buildings. Once inside, she locked the door behind them, securing it with multiple locks. The house was simple, clean, and far from the luxurious life Ethan had known, but it was quiet and safe, at least for now. They were here to regroup, to make their next move. "You're not alone in this," Naomi said as she set down the bag she had been carrying. "I'm not going to let them take you down, not after everything you've been through. We'll do this together." Ethan looked at her, his face a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. For the first time in days, he didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Naomi had given him something he hadn't realized he needed: hope. The kind of hope that wasn't about running away, but standing up and fighting back. Naomi began sorting through papers on the small table in the corner of the room. "We need to get the evidence out," she said, her voice steady. "We need to make sure everyone knows what's going on. I don't care if they try to shut us down. We can't let them get away with this." Ethan nodded, a sense of determination building inside him. He had been a leader in his world, but now he was learning how to be a leader in a different way, by choosing to do what was right, even if it meant putting himself in harm's way. "What's the plan?" he asked, his voice firm now. Naomi looked at him, a slight smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "First, we get the evidence into the right hands. We send it to the press, to the authorities. We make sure they can't sweep this under the rug." Ethan was silent for a moment, considering her words. It felt like a lifetime ago when he had lived in a world of power and influence, a world where a single phone call could change the course of an entire industry. Now, it seemed like all those connections had vanished, like they never mattered. "What if they come for us before we can do anything?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Naomi's expression softened, but there was a quiet resolve in her eyes. "They will come for us, Ethan. I can guarantee that. But the more we fight back, the harder it will be for them to win. We need to stay ahead of them, be one step smarter." Ethan wasn't sure if he was ready for everything that lay ahead, but he didn't have a choice. He had been running for too long, and now, standing here in this house with Naomi, he realized something he hadn't fully understood until now. He was in control of his future, and no one was going to take that away from him. Naomi gathered up the papers she had been going through and handed them to him. "Get this to the right person, someone we can trust," she said. "I'll handle the rest." Ethan looked at the stack of papers, his mind racing with the possibilities. It was risky, but Naomi was right. This was the only chance they had. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. Naomi nodded, her eyes locking with his. "We'll do this together, no matter what." And with that, they both took a deep breath and walked out of the safe house, ready to face whatever came next, ready to fight for what was right. Naomi and Ethan moved quickly through the city, the weight of the decision pressing down on them as they made their way to the meeting point. It was no longer just about surviving. Now it was about making sure the truth was out, and that nothing could stop them from exposing the corruption they had uncovered. The plan was simple, but that didn't make it any less dangerous. Naomi had arranged a secure drop-off with a journalist who had been investigating the same people who had wronged them. It wasn't ideal, but it was their best shot. The city was still damp from the storm, the air heavy with the threat of more rain. Naomi kept a careful eye on their surroundings as they walked, her senses alert for any sign that they were being followed. Ethan walked beside her, his pace slower than hers, his body still recovering from the injuries he had sustained, but his determination clear. They reached a quiet alley near the edge of downtown, where Naomi had set up the meeting. She glanced around once more, then led Ethan to a door that was barely visible behind an overgrown, ivy-covered wall. She knocked twice, a sharp, quick rap. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 30s, wearing a leather jacket and a look of quiet urgency. "Naomi, right?" the woman asked, her voice low. "I'm Claire." Naomi nodded, relieved to see her. "It's good to meet you," she said, trying to hide the tension in her voice. Claire stepped aside, allowing them to enter the small, dimly lit room. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and old newspapers, and the walls were lined with clippings and files, evidence of years of investigation. "We don't have much time," Claire said, closing the door behind them. "I've been digging into the people you mentioned, but I need more. I need everything you've got." Naomi handed over the stack of papers she had been carrying, her heart racing. "This is everything," she said. "Proof of everything they've been hiding. It's all in there. Bank accounts, illegal transactions, even records of bribery." Claire took the papers, her eyes scanning them quickly, then looked up at them. "This is big," she said. "Real big. You realize that, right? If we release this, there's no going back." Naomi nodded, meeting Claire's gaze. "We know," she said, her voice steady. "We're not turning back now." Ethan, who had been silent for most of the conversation, spoke up. "We need this to get out. We need to make sure they can't silence us." Claire studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I can get this to the right people. It'll take time, but I'll make sure the story gets out. But I need you both to stay out of sight for now. If they're looking for you, we can't afford to have you exposed." Naomi knew she was right. The next steps had to be carefully calculated. They couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. "You'll be safe here for now," Claire continued. "But once the story breaks, they'll come for all of us. Be ready for that." Naomi's heart pounded in her chest. They had come this far, but they still weren't out of danger. The real fight was only just beginning. As Naomi and Ethan left the safe house, Naomi felt the weight of what they had done. There was no turning back now. The truth was out, and it was only a matter of time before the world would know the full extent of the corruption they had uncovered. They didn't know what would happen next, but they were ready. They had no choice but to be ready. The days that followed felt like a blur. Naomi and Ethan kept their heads down, staying out of sight, knowing they were walking on a razor's edge. The weight of their actions, of everything they had set in motion, pressed down on them with every passing hour. The journalist, Claire, had promised to get the story out, but Naomi knew it would take time. Time they didn't have. The longer they waited, the closer the people who wanted them silenced came. Naomi spent her days trying to stay calm, keeping busy with whatever she could find to do in the small, dimly lit room they were hiding in. Ethan, on the other hand, was consumed with anger and frustration. He had always been a man of action, someone who believed in using power to solve problems, but now, he was at the mercy of the world he had once controlled. He hated feeling powerless. But Naomi, ever the pragmatist, kept reminding him that they had to stay patient. "The truth is out there now," she would say. "They can't erase it." One evening, as Naomi and Ethan sat in silence, waiting for any sign that the story had been released, Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. "We've done everything we can," he said, his voice steady. "It's just a matter of time now." Naomi nodded, but there was a part of her that couldn't help but feel the weight of their choices. They had put everything on the line. Her life, his life, their future. It was a gamble, and they didn't know what the outcome would be. The phone call came 2 days later. Claire's voice was crackling with urgency on the other end. "It's out," she said. "The story's everywhere. It's going viral. You need to prepare yourselves." Naomi's heart skipped a beat. The truth was finally out. But as she looked at Ethan, she saw the same fear in his eyes that she had felt from the very beginning. The storm was far from over. They had exposed the darkness, but now, they would have to face the consequences. The consequences of their actions. Naomi took a deep breath, steadying herself. There was no turning back. The fight had only just begun, but one thing was certain, they would never be the same again. The world had seen them, and now, they had no choice but to stand tall and face whatever came next.